All right. In this screencast, we're going to talk about the fact that you need to be able to draw and recognize molecular diagrams of a list of organic molecules. You need to be able to draw by heart a glucose, a ribose, a saturated fatty acid, and a generalized amino acid. Before I dig into the details of what they look like, there's some terms that I want you to be familiar with, and these are functional groups. You don't need to pull these out, but do start to recognize if I say a hydroxyl group, it's generally going to be represented as an OH. So in a lot of these organic molecules, you're going to see kind of these common groups attached to some of these molecules. So a hydroxyl group would be an oxygen and a hydrogen together. An amine group, you'll see there's going to be a nitrogen with two hydrogens. A carboxyl group has a carbon with a double bonded oxygen and a carbon bonded to an oxygen bonded to a hydrogen. You might see it written like that. And a methyl group. So a methyl group is where you've got a carbon with three hydrogens attached to it, so CH3. So you might hear these terms when we're talking about these different groups and pointing them out. Okay, but let's talk about the different things that you need to be able to draw. All right, you need to be able to draw a glucose molecule. And there's two types of glucose molecules. There's an alpha glucose molecule and a beta glucose molecule. You should be able to draw them both. The alpha glucose molecule is the one that's in like starches and most of the foods that we eat, like different starches. And it's also how we put together glucose alpha molecules to make glycogen, a more complex carbohydrate. But there's also beta glucose molecules that are made and put together by plants, which create cellulose and things in the cell wall. So there's only one little difference between them, and that's where this hydroxyl group is in comparison to the hydrogen. So you can see they're flipped. The alpha glucose molecule, if you were to draw it, so you want to draw it in the ring form, you can see it's a six-sided sugar, a hexose sugar. There is an oxygen in the upper right-hand corner at about 1 o'clock. Now, from that oxygen, each of these corners technically have a carbon, and I would actually write a C where these carbons are. So you've got an oxygen, there should be a carbon here, a carbon here, a carbon here, a carbon here, and a carbon here. And then here's our last carbon up here. Because glucose is technically C6H12O6, so you need one of each of those molecules. And then see this number here, this 1, and there would be a 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 carbons. They will often number the carbons in a sugar molecule, you'll see them when we start doing DNA and other things. So in this, they'll start with the oxygen, and the first carbon gets the 1. So that's carbon 1, carbon 2, 3, 4, 5 is here at this corner, and then 6. Okay, so you can see you can pause this or look in your book, and you can see where you want to add hydrogens and hydroxyl. Hydrogen, hydroxyl, hydroxyl, hydrogen, hydroxyl, hydrogen, so on. And then the CH2OH at the top. So this little bit here, okay? That's the glucose molecule for alpha glucose. And then the beta glucose just has on the first carbon, the hydroxyl and hydrogen are flipped. All right, the next thing, this is a ribose. A ribose molecule has an oxygen at the top. Notice it's a 5-carbon sugar. It says 5 ring, right? It's also a 5-carbon sugar. So we've got the oxygen at the top of the house, and then carbon 1, carbon 2, carbon 3, carbon 4, and then that carbon 5 up here, okay? So this first one, in the first carbon, you can see there's a hydroxyl hydrogen, hydrogen hydroxyl, hydrogen hydroxyl. There's just a hydrogen off of this one, and then you can see we've got a carbon. This is a COH3, so there's hydrogen, hydrogen. This is attached to the oxygen, and then that's to the hydrogen. So make sure you take some time to practice this. I had mentioned that it's important to know how many times everything bonds. You can actually check to see if you've done it correctly, if you can count the number of bonds with each of the molecules. So you know that carbon bonds 4 times, so there should only be 4 bonds coming out of each carbon. Oxygen bonds twice, so once here with that carbon, and then the other one will be to the hydrogen. So you can see this oxygen is bonded once and then twice. So you can kind of go through and check to make sure that there's the correct number of bonds. All right. The fatty acid that you need to be able to do, this is a really complicated one. You don't need to do all of them, so many carbons, but the generalized fatty acid has a carboxyl group here, just this bit, carbon with a double bonded oxygen with a carbon and the hydroxyl group, okay? So draw this part here, and then you can draw a chain of carbons down. It can be as many carbons as you want. It can be 3 carbons or 4 carbons or 10 carbons, whatever. And off of each of those carbons, you just draw hydrogen off of all of them. That's going to be your generalized fatty acid, okay? You don't need to worry. This glycerol you don't need to do. This is just the fatty acid that you need to be able to draw right now. The glycerol, when we start doing fats, you'll want to be able to draw because there's 3 carbons, and then you've got hydroxyls off of 3 of those, and then hydrogens off the others. Okay, this is a simplified fatty acid. So remember, as I said, there's a carboxyl at one end and then a long string of carbons with the hydrogens all hanging off. And this is kind of a simplified way of doing it, saying long string of carbons with the hydrogens off of either side. And that end just means it's an unspecified number of repeats, okay, with the carboxyl at the end. And that CH3 would be showing this CH3, okay? Amino acid, this one's a very important one. This is how you would normally be drawing it. So you've got a carbon in the middle, and there'll be an R group on one side. You just draw the letter R, a hydrogen on the other side, okay? Then you'll draw a carboxyl group off of one side. So the C double bonded to the oxygen and the carbon single bonded to the oxygen and then the hydrogen. And there's an amine group on the other side. So nitrogen with 2 hydrogens. So when you're drawing it, draw a carbon with an R group and a hydrogen, then a carboxyl group on one side and an amine group on the other side. So you need to be able to identify sugars, lipids, amino acids from these molecular diagrams as well. And you can see this is a glucose molecule with a fructose molecule. So you can tell by the way that they're shaped, we've got 2 monomer sugars coming together, and there's a sucrose, right? You can see that this is called a triglyceride, but see all these fatty acid tails? You should be able to recognize them, okay? This is a phospholipid. We've seen those before, right, when we're doing cell membranes. This is a steroid, which is a type of lipid that we'll get to know. These are all amino acids. So there's 20 different amino acids. You do not need to know them all. You just need to know the generalized amino acids. So you remember, we've got a carbon with an R group, which is this part in white, here, right? And a hydrogen on either side. And then it's got a carboxyl group on one side and an amine group on the other. So this is an amino acid that's more specific, but you only need to be able to draw the carbon with a hydrogen, an R group, the carboxyl group, and the amine group. This should also have an H next to it, by the way. But if you see this as the base and just realize that it's got this R group, the R is actually a stand-in place for this extra long, piece that's attached. These are other amino acids. You can see it's got the carboxyl groups. So these are all put together. We're going to learn how to draw a peptide bond when you bring together one amino acid and another with this condensation reaction, and you end up getting that peptide bond between them. We'll be practicing that as well. Okay, so what I want you to go back and practice right now is you need to be able to draw glucose, ribose, a saturated fatty acid, and a generalized amino acid. And we'll practice with recognizing some in our next class.